Hi folks, you're with Taskless today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about, and I've done a couple of essays on this, but I talk about inflation. I sort of want to maybe explain it just a little bit more carefully than before, because the mainstream media and most of the media channels, or even some of the commentators on YouTube are maybe not quite understanding how this inflation is being applied. Now, I'll give you some examples of where inflation is desirable. Let's suppose and I'll just use simple round numbers here. Let's suppose you buy a house for $100 and you borrow $95 to buy the house. You've got $5 sort of deposit. Now, if the price of real estate, for example, doubles in 12 months, like the rate of inflation is effectively 100% on property, residential property, then you've made quite a lot of money very quickly. So suddenly your cost of ownership has declined in proportion, because you can sell it now at any time and bank a pretty decent profit. So on a relative basis, your leverage has obviously declined substantially, and your return has increased substantially. So your debt is easier to service, in as much you've got so much equity in it now. So that's where inflation makes you rich, or well-to-do, depending on how much property you've got. Now, the globalists are heavily invested in private or residential real estate. So they're able to buy the real estate up beforehand, and then really push the inflation button as hard as they can, and so they make then bonanza profits from that. So this is where inflation is desirable. Now, if you've only got one house, which is what most people do, or none, if you only got one house, then inflation may increase the price of your house. And gee, well, that's good. But if you want to buy another house, that's also gone through price inflation. So you're not really any further in front. And unless that's an asset that appreciates at all proportion, then it isn't something you've got in terms of an asset like to hand on to your kids or other family members. Not that you want to. Pretty much everyone I know who's say over 70, and they've got a few kids, and the house price is really gone through some serious inflation. The kids are almost begging the parents to die quickly so they can get their hands on the house. So it's not a formula for happy relationships with your offspring there. Certainly not from what I've seen anyway. Now that's so house prices inflating. This is where the big money and the globalist money moves in big quantities, the big end of town, the big banks. So they go in and they park their money there. Then they set about triggering inflation. So they go and buy up all this real estate. Then they go to the government and say, look, can you let in all these rich Chinese goons and Brahmin goons from India, Russian mafia? Can you let all these people in to buy real estate? It'll really inflate the price of real estate. We've got huge holdings in real estate. It'll make us mega rich if you do that. Going, yeah, okay, what's in it for us? Well, we'll cut you in on the deal. We'll make sure that you. And there are politicians I know that were worth, $1 million 10 years ago, or that politicians I'm aware of that were worth $1 million 10 years ago, now worth $30 million. That sort of thing. And it's all done through flipping real estate, in effect. And they're being shepherded into that. The banks are pointing them at which properties to buy, and then lining up the Chinese buyer to buy it at well over market price, because the Chinese are just laundering the money, really, using Western real estate to do it. So that's one of the inflation scams that's going at the moment. So when people just talk about inflation going sky high, it's targeted in pockets, and wherever the globalists and the banks and the big financial firms, wherever they have huge holdings, it's in those areas where the inflation's taking place. So energy, food, water distribution, when you turn on the tap or the faucet, and property, land and property development. That's where the the big monies, or the share market as well. That's where the big money is moved and parked, and that's where the artificial. Now the inflation is extremely artificial. It's not real. I mean, and you'll see a huge deviation from intrinsic value and then the inflated or artificial value. The stock market is a classic case of that. And it's property in the stock market are probably overvalued by 50 to 60% from any reality. And in order to gauge reality, you look at the movement of the average wage in any Western country, and then you consider, okay, the time of a mortgage, the cost of having children, and so on. And so, in Sydney, even ordinary houses in the outer suburbs are selling for over $1 million now. But the reality is they're closer to maybe 320,000 in real terms, given the wages today and the cost of raising a family and all that sort of stuff. So really, if real estate prices are driven by the capacity of people to pay those prices, then it's inflated beyond all proportion from the local population to pay these sort of prices the real estate is. So you're seeing that deviation. Now, food production and whether it's basic things like milk or egg, producing eggs, chicken, beef. It doesn't matter. Just about any area of food production is owned. The big investment firms and the big multinational food firms are bought up big. There's hardly anything left in Australia. I don't think there's an Australian dairy. And Australia had a huge dairy industry. It's all local. I mean, today I don't think any of it's local. It's owned a couple of small boutique ones, but it's all owned now by the big multinationals and into bulk milk production, powdered milk, and so on. So there's been a lot of inflation in that area. Now this is particularly annoying because these big financial firms, they've done all sorts of overseas borrowing and price offsetting and charging management fees in this country, moving the money to that country, then loaning it out into a third country to buy up assets. So they're not paying tax. They're getting, they're getting abnormal returns just from all that international money moving chicanery, which means that the locals sort of can't compete in that space, which means they can overpay for assets. They can pay far too much for an asset. These guys bringing the money in from overseas, the globalists, the big multinational firms, they can pay far too much for an asset because they know they don't have to pay tax for 20 years, and they can bring in all this cheap labor from overseas, have all these fake adverts running, job adverts running. So I know we can't find people to do that. We've got to employ an illiterate peasant from Africa at half the wage that anyone else. This sort of thing. So there's all these things going on which are tearing at the fabric of Western society and the sort of equity and equality that we had here. All that's being abandoned. So we're losing all the equity and all the equality that existed through the wage system and the fact that the things like housing and all that sort of stuff was affordable for the people that lived in the Western countries. All that's disappeared now, and instead we get transgender bathrooms and fucking pronouns. Oh, that's equality. That's the new equality. So the new equality means penniless serf peasants, but lots of transgender bathrooms and pronouns. I mean, it's bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. I don't know how people are suckering for it. But on the other side of inflation, coming back to inflation rather, if we look at all the money that the globalists and the big end of town pumped into things and where they put it, energy as an example, where they put it, those are the areas where there's what as economists would say, supranormal inflation. The other areas, there's no real inflation or not very much. Say you look in something like a real competitive market, motor cars as an example. For what you get, the prices there are relatively, maybe slightly more expensive, but in purchasing power terms, it's about the same as it was in 1970, give or take. And you get more car now for your money, but it's about the same as it was. Consumer electronics, much better value now, and so on. But those competitive areas, wherever there's good extensive market competition, a lot of players chasing, innovation's important, all that sort of thing, then those jobs have all been moved offshore to cheap labour countries. to do. So whenever you see that sort of competitiveness there in the market, then they're moved offshore. So again, they're bypassing, the multinationals are bypassing the market system. So if you make it in the United States, as an example, then the price has to be, the cost of production is X, so the price has to be within a certain range if you're going to make it something that's available to pretty much all the people to buy as a consumer product. But they're bypassing all these checks and balances that were an intrinsic part of Western society. They're bypassing all these and creating artificial inflation in the asset classes where they hold or they have large holdings. Now that's what's happening in inflation today. And it's being artificially manufactured by the globalists. And they're really being helped along by the Western governments, who all are owned by the globalists anyway. Media won't talk about it because, again, they're owned by the globalists. So in a city like Sydney, if you want to get ahead, say, in the middle range, sort of the $2 million is really the entry level for real estate in that middle range for a house. And that'll be an ordinary house. It'll be a 3-bedroom house. It'll be nice enough for $2 million. I mean, fuck. So now, in order to be able to play in that league from your own income, not if you inherit something, you need an income of better than $250,000 a year, and you need to have it for a good 15 years if you're going to acquire assets in that class, and if you've even got a hope of having children. So this sort of artificially forced inflation, like artificially forced immigration and this sort of stuff, it's having a devastating effect on the Western society and the Western economies, and our governments aren't doing a thing to stop it. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.